Hello, and welcome to the FarmHouse. I'm Candace Werspowski.
And I'm Stephanie Spiker.
And recently, I spoke to Kathy Smith, a forestry expert with more than 30 years of experience helping farmers and landowners manage trees and woodlands. Kathy is an Ohio State Extension agent, and she's the program director for the school's forestry program, which she received her own degree from. So how's that for coming full circle? So now, Kathy spends her time advising folks on how to integrate trees into farms or how to manage challenges like invasive species. But before we dive into that, I have a little word association game for you, Steph.
All right.
I'm going to start a sentence, and I'd like you to try to complete it for me. And this is based off a quote from a farmer that Kathy encountered early in her career. All right? The quote is, "The best thing for a tree is..."
I'm going to say a person who cares about it.
One would hope.
Yeah.
The full quote is actually, "The best thing for a tree is a chainsaw." And you can imagine
I don't agree.
No, me neither. But you can imagine how a forestry expert might feel about hearing that. I'm going to let Kathy tell that story. But spoiler alert, it turns out that that farmer might not have been 100% wrong.
Okay.
All right, so let's see how. Kathy, welcome to the FarmHouse.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So what are some benefits of integrating trees into traditional farming operations?
So it depends on how you want to integrate them. I know that, there's some thought process that, they're just in the way. They're a problem. And I think when I started my job, I actually had a farmer say to me that the best thing for a tree was a chainsaw. So it just takes all kinds of different perspectives. A lot of times you're looking at things like windbreaks that would allow to deal with, hopefully, placed properly, you'll increase crop production. You'll have a little bit better production on whatever crop we're talking about. Riparian buffers where we can filter out nutrients and pesticides before they hit the body of water. So there's plenty of ways. And then sometimes it's just wildlife habitat, clean air, clean water, those kind of basic things that we talk about when we talk about planting trees.
Right, right. So it's interesting that you bring up wildlife habitat, because I know that kind of becomes a double-edged sword almost for some farmers, because yes, we want to encourage, being good stewards of the land. Mm-hmm. However, there is such a thing as wildlife crop damage. So at some point you need to be wary of that. How should farmers, try to strike that balance?
So I think the balance comes in looking at how you place and what trees you place. So different tree species provide different things for wildlife. And so there are wildlife species, that depend on hard mass trees like oaks and hickories and walnuts, maybe beech. So you kind of have to think about, is this something that is going to be highly desirable by certain species? Maybe that's not what I want to put in this location. So you do have to kind of pay attention to what the tree species are and what those benefits are. There are some species that it won't matter, but there are definitely wildlife species that look for those mast and the food that they're producing, which is what mast is, whether it's hard mast and the acorns and that, or whether it's soft mast, that something like maples that produce a little bit lightweight seed that birds can pick up and take off with. Mm-hmm. So there's a balance there, and you have to kind of think about, what am I trying to accomplish on the wildlife side?
Right.
And, I live in the country, and I currently am dealing with a mama raccoon and 5 little babies. So I get it.
Yeah. We've exchanged all sorts of tales of woe about, our gardens getting just, I'll say, visited by wildlife. Yeah. I could say other things.
Well, they're visiting my front porch. Mama brings them up on the porch, and they go through everything on the porch.
They sound like they're very comfortable.
Yes, they are.
Oh man, I woke up the other day and found that deer had just gone to town on the morning
Oh,
glories that I had out on our signpost.
oh,
Oh, I was
yes.
devastated. So
Yep.
were the morning glories. So, all right. So for people who have woodlands on their property, what are some basic things they should do to manage that kind of landscape?
So woodland management really does come down to what are you trying to accomplish? Are you managing the woods for timber? Are you managing it for maybe timber and wildlife or just recreation? And when we talk wildlife, it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. What kinds of wildlife? Are we talking birds? Are we talking mammals, specific mammals? So those are some questions that you need to answer. I always tell landowners, whether it's on a napkin or a piece of paper or just in your head, you kind of need to think about what you want from the woods. And then you move forward and you have to figure out, what do you have? What tree species do you have? What sizes do you have? And if you don't have what you need today, what can you do practice-wise to get you where you want to be? And so it's kind of like, this is what I want. This is what I have. How do we make them work together if we can? So there's plenty of assistance out there that foresters with the state and foresters that are consulting foresters that can walk the woods with you and give you some suggestions. And I always suggest that folks do that, because if you don't quite know what you've got, you need somebody to kind of help you walk through that process the first time.
Right. And it sounds like everyone is going to need that sort of like tailored plan because no
Mm-hmm.
two woodlands are going to be the same.
Right, right. And a lot of woodland owners these days are dealing with the remnants of the emerald ash borer infestations that we
Mhm.
had and all the dead ash. I still have live ash in my woods, but I have a lot of dead ones. And so it's frustrating, but it's one of those things we have to deal with. If you have a lot of ash and a lot of dead ash, then you have open pockets that allow things like invasive species to come in. So it creates that second step that woodland owners today need to really pay attention to and understand where they have issues.
Okay. We're going to circle back to invasive species in a second here.
That's a big topic.
But yeah, yeah. So it does sound, that it is some work to manage these woodlands. And I have to wonder if a lot of people have the misconception that, a woodland, a forest, it'll take care of itself. There's not really much I need to do. What are some other common mistakes or perhaps misconceptions that people have about managing woodlands on their property?
So I think you're right. There are a lot of woodland owners who maybe buy a small woodland, build a house, and they bought the woods because it has wildflowers or it has mushrooms or, whatever that they were looking for. But understand that it's a living system and things change. So emerald ash borer would be one of those things that came along. And even in my own woods, I had a section where, the ash was kind of my focus. Emerald ash borer comes along and all of a sudden I have to shift gears because that species is no longer there. And it opened up the canopy to species I didn't want or invasive species. So I think you need to know what you have, so that when things come along, you know what your risk is for having to do that. And also realize that, like I said, it's a living system. And so it's going to change. As we see more rain, more heat, we're going to see species shifts. And it's things you're not going to be able to stop. So you need to understand what the consequences are. And I've always said to folks, probably before we really had to deal with the invasive species issue, if you laid out all the pros and cons of doing nothing, hands off, let Mother Nature take its course, and you were okay with those pros and cons, fine. Hands off, let nature take its course. But I think today with the invasive species issue, insects and plants, that's a less viable option. I think that most woodland owners need to look at their woods and try to be proactive instead of reactive when we come to some of these situations.
Mm-hmm. So what about small acreage landowners? How can they make the most of their woodland resources?
So we just did a workshop in Southwest Ohio on managing small woodlands. And for a lot of us, again, it kind of goes back to that, what are you wanting to accomplish? But if you're looking to make some money off of it, just because it's small doesn't mean that there isn't a potential to also do a timber sale. I've marked timber sales in my past life on, small acreages, 10 acres, 15 acres. I've got a couple of consultants that I've talked to recently that said they've even marked timber sales on 3-acre tracts. So there's always that potential depending on what's there, what's available to harvest. But if you're just looking for other options to maybe make some income, if you've got maples, you can look at maple syrup. That would be another sustainable ag product that would put some money in the pocket, depending on how many taps you can put out. There's always things like florals. We laugh about, we want grapevines out of our trees most of the time. So grapevine wreaths, grapevine crafts, those kind of things. There's all sorts of those kind of things. You can kind of go down that path and look at the non-timber product side of things if you're looking for income. And then sometimes it's just enjoyment. Spring wildflowers, mushroom hikes, and learning your mushrooms and which ones to eat and which ones not to eat is critical.
Yeah. I feel like that's a kind of emerging trend in the last few years, these mushroom hikes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you seeing a lot more of that out in Ohio? Or?
We see a lot more questions on it, and we've got a couple of our county educators that are focused on mushrooms, whether they're living in your woods or whether you want to propagate them on some material. We're seeing much more of that interest coming about.
Interesting. All right. So it's time to talk about invasive species. It's something that comes up all the time. We talk about gardening on this podcast, and it's an issue there. But it's also, like you've been saying, an issue in woodland management. So, what invasive plant species are the most problematic in the Mid-Atlantic region right now, would you say?
Boy, that can really vary. Bush honeysuckle and autumn olive probably pop to the top of the list, with garlic mustard in some places. Privet in some locations. So there are parts of Ohio that are really heavily impacted by privet, and then there are other parts of Ohio where you don't see it at all. So I think some of that has to do with where it came from in the landscape, right? So where was it planted in order to bring that fruit into those native areas? Ailanthus would be one of those that we talk about tree-wise. Calorie pear is probably the big one that has hit in the last few years. We fell in love with it for street trees and yard trees, and now it's a huge pain out in the natural areas. So it's burning bush is another one that is starting to become a big issue. I actually just hired a TSI vendor to go through a section of the woods and deal with multiflora rose and burning bush, because I have burning bush coming in small. They're just small, but it's like, let's get them now before they become huge plants.
Yeah. So what happens when something like privet or burning bush comes into a woodland and begins to kind of take over? Why is it a problem?
So it's a problem because almost all of these plants leaf out before our natives. So in the spring, they jump on it. They're there, they leaf out, and they basically shade out some of our native plants. Many times the fruit that they provide is not as nutritional for wildlife. There's a lot of studies on bush honeysuckle and cardinals and how they're impacting cardinals and their breeding habits. And so there's things like that. Pollinators look for specific species, and some of these are not the best when it comes to healthy food requirements, I guess, for the pollinators. So in your woods, they become such a thick carpet that they block out all of your spring wildflowers. You can pretty much forget some of the mushrooms. and regeneration. So if you're hoping to have a forest into the future, you need seedlings to regenerate, and most of these plants will become so thick and competitive, and some of them put out allelopathic compounds that inhibit some of that regeneration. So you don't have that next future stand coming up. You end up with big trees, an understory of invasive plants, and nothing for the future if you take the invasive plants out. So a lot of issues.
Yeah. So speaking of taking them out, what can landowners do to combat or replace invasive species within their woodlands?
So sometimes it's depending on how bad the infestation is. I just spent the morning working with a woodland owner over email on dealing with Oriental bittersweet. So sometimes he's got a vendor that he's hired. They've had some success, but they haven't had as much success as they feel like they should have for what practices they've tried. So we were trying to find them some other options for practices and for chemical applications. When it comes to small infestations, you're walking through the woods and you see a burning bush crop up, pull it. I mean, that's kind of the simplest way when you're just seeing early infestations. If you've got lots of plants, you may look at either, if you're comfortable going after them yourself with chemicals or some type of mechanical means of getting rid of them, or hiring a vendor who can come in and do that work for you.
Okay. It's almost like circling back to that comment at the beginning that these are the trees that need a chainsaw.
Yep.
Right.
Definitely.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk about you before we wrap up. What made you decide to specialize in forestry?
Oh, wow. You go back and I think in high school and that, where am I going to do? What am I going to study? My goal was to have a job that I work outside. And that really was kind of the force that pushed me towards natural resources. I think that forestry just kind of fell into the niche. I can honestly say that in my 30 years that I've been doing this, I appreciate being able to understand the trees and how we can utilize trees to solve problems, make things better, and also help landowners to deal with the issues that they have, whether it's in a woodland or whether sometimes I get pulled into that urban side, to deal with individual trees, which is a challenge. But we get trees everywhere, and they all have some issues that someone needs to try to answer the question for.
Gotcha. Okay, so last question, and we ask this of everyone who comes on our podcast. What does it mean to you to be a woman in agriculture?
So I think that when I started, there weren't a lot of us. It was a small group. I think when I graduated from college, there were like 5 of us in a class of 30 or 35. And you understand that was kind of those first steps. There weren't a lot of women. I even had a professor at the time when I was applying for jobs saying, "Oh, don't apply to them because they won't hire women." I can honestly say that's changed. I actually now probably work with more women in the field than I do men sometimes. And so I've seen that change. I don't know that I've ever looked at myself as I'm a female, out in the field. But you come up against that prejudice, I guess you want to say, or that thought process for folks that, oh, she's a female, I'm going to try to stump her. I did have some landowners early on that, it was kind of like, so, what do you think that tree is? Or, just try to do some quick, and what you do is you do the job and end up having a lot of landowners that are depending on you. When I moved, my first job was with the Ohio Division of Forestry, and when I moved to Ohio State and Extension, I had a boatload of those landowners that tracked me down and still to this day email me with questions or call with things. And so you make those relationships, and I think the rest of it doesn't matter at that point.
Great. And, as we finish up, like you were just saying, if people do have woodlands and they have questions or need guidance, Extension is a great resource for them, whether they're in Ohio and they can use the Ohio State Extension, or I'm in Pennsylvania. I know Penn State, we've got Extension there. So yeah, I guess put in a little plug.
I work with a couple of your extension foresters in Pennsylvania, so
Yeah.
I'm doing some maple stuff. Yeah. So Extension's a great place to start. Your local, if you've got a soil and water conservation district or the DNR, those are all great places to start. And most of the time you're going to find somebody, and if they can't answer your question, they're going to help you find that answer.
Great. All right. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Well, as someone who really does love trees, I really enjoyed hearing your conversation with Kathy. I feel like she's almost in some way like the Lorax. She speaks for the trees.
I'm sure she'd appreciate that.
I hope so. So the one thing she said that I just adored was how people who buy a wooded area or even just enjoy a wooded area need to understand that the woods are a living thing and like a whole living system, and things change. And I feel like never would have thought that way. And I do genuinely love to spend time in the woods. And so I guess I understand, like, yeah, the woods are living for sure. But to think like, yeah, like things do change. And that's something that I had to kind of stop and think about for a second, because where I grew up when I was a teenager, we had, I think, about 3 acres of woods. And I mean, I thought they were beautiful. I loved living there, and we had little pathways through them and everything. And when my parents sold the house, I drove past a few months later after it was sold, and the new owners had done a lot of logging, and it looked very different. It was very open. My favorite tree was cut down, and it just kind of broke my heart. And so it's interesting to think about that, like, well, the system is alive, so things are eventually going to change. Eventually,
Right.
Even if they wouldn't have cut it down, one day my favorite tree would have fallen down, like it's not going to be there forever. So that is, I'm sure, something people don't think about when they buy wooded property, is like some of it's out of your control, especially talking about like the diseases and stuff. Like that was interesting for sure.
But it's like you still have to straddle the line, right? Because like some of it is in your control and it's your responsibility. I thought it was very interesting when, I asked her about like, what help does a forest really need? Like, can't forests really manage themselves? And the answer is, well, technically they can, but if you want it to be thriving and the best it can be, then you do need to intercede at times.
Yeah.
Which is where the chainsaw might come in if you wind up getting some of these invasive trees or other kinds of plants coming in. You want to make sure you're yanking those out.
Yeah. It was so interesting hearing her talk about kind of just her personal journey as a woman in the industry of more in the forestry industry. And it was so interesting hearing that when she was first coming into it, being told, like, don't bother applying there. Like, you're a woman, they won't hire you. What a discouraging thing to hear. And I really hope that's changed over the years. But I will say, I was not surprised in the slightest hearing that, when she would go out on jobs or calls or whatever, people would almost have to test her knowledge and be like, what is this tree? What is this tree?
Well, it's the same thing. If someone, I'm sure you've experienced this stuff because you're a sports fan and you love the Phillies. Have you ever been asked, like, okay, well, can you name like 5, like name me the starting lineup for the Phillies or something like that?
For sure. That has definitely happened in my lifetime. And probably many women, whether it's their career or as a sports fan, or if they say they like a certain movie, it's like we have to justify our knowledge somehow.
You have to prove your bona fides.
Yeah. So it was something like disappointed but not surprised type of thing. But hey, listening to that interview, clearly she knows her stuff about trees. that is going to wrap it up for us this week. Thank you guys for listening. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. And if you really like this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any thoughts or questions about this episode, you can email us at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you again for listening and visiting the farmhouse. I'm Candace.
And I'm Stephanie.
And we'll talk to you later.
Bye. This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2025 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock. It was mixed by Justin Berger. Music by Tin Bird Shadow.